world is becoming more unglued by the day. Local consequences are now showing up. We are seeing sky-high gas prices, higher food prices, shortages, and more. How should you respond? Go to redpills.tv/patriot. That's redpills.tv/patriot. And secure your long-term emergency food storage from My Patriot Supply. My Patriot Supply is by far the largest preparedness company in America. They're in stock and shipping quickly in unmarked boxes to your door. Their emergency food supplies last up to 25 years in storage. When you need it, it'll be there. Lunches, dinners, drinks, and snacks totaling over 2,000 calories a day. Get free shipping on any order over $99. Again, go to redpills.tv/patriot.
Spaceship in the sky to the simulation in the mind. Let's all embark on another journey of Conversations on the Fringe.
Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're in the world. My name is Josh. That is my guest tonight, Michael Cremo. This is the Red Pill Project's Conversations on the Fringe, live with you every Friday night, 7:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is where we talk about those things that aren't normally talked about, the weird, the wacky, the unusual, the conspiratorial, those things that are outside of the normal conversations between people that really need to be talked about. And tonight we're going to be talking about hidden mysteries, forbidden archaeology with Michael. I almost said Dr. Michael Cremo. You should be a doctor. They should give you an honorary PhD, I'm telling you. For those that don't know, Michael Cremo is a member of the History of Science Society, the World Archaeological Congress, the Philosophy of Science Association, the European Association of Archaeologists, and a research associate in History and Philosophy of Science for the Bhagavavedanta Institute. After receiving a scholarship in study of international affairs at George Washington University, Michael began to study the ancient histories of India, known as the Vedas. In this way, he has broadened his academic knowledge with spirituality from Eastern tradition. As well, he has been a researcher and investigator and a prolific author and lecturer on Earth's ancient mysteries. And this comes about in the sense of archaeology, of these things in the sense that science has forgotten, made to forget, wanted to forget, and no longer talks about, and is hidden in the basement of the Smithsonian and long since destroyed. Michael, how are you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure having you on Mars Chronicles a few weeks ago. David and I were incredibly happy with the show, the conversation, how it went, and absolutely with you and your just stellar amount of knowledge that you have.
Yeah, I was happy with it too. It was a really interesting conversation. You brought up many things that aren't usually brought up. I've done quite a few of these interviews over the years. I have to say that you and Dave got some really good questions in there.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know David does as well. But tonight I got you all to myself, and we were just kind of discussing what we should talk about. I mean, you're a man who can talk about many different topics, and we've done that before on this show. I was hoping tonight you could really kind of discuss with us a lot of what the Vedas are, who the Vedas were, and how all of this fits into Earth's origins.
Well, there are many wisdom traditions all over the world. And I don't claim that I have any monopoly on truth. But as we each individually follow our path and try to make sense of things, we make use of different resources that come to our attention. So that's just a preface before I say anything about the Vedic tradition, because I think it involves universal kinds of things that everyone thinks about, and that you'll find answers for in other places as well. But I found the Vedic tradition particularly helpful for me. And Veda is a Sanskrit word. It means knowledge. So it includes all kinds of knowledge, whether we're talking about astronomy or history or cosmology or any type of knowledge, basic knowledge, fundamental truths, whether they involve material reality or things beyond that. And I think there is a lot beyond what's presently available to our senses. And that may mean we have to tune our senses a little bit in order to get that level of perception. And I think that's the purpose of different systems of yoga, meditation, prayer, contemplation that you find in different wisdom traditions.
Yeah, I was telling you that, one of my first encounters with spirituality was with a trilogy of books, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and the Dhammapadas. And if anybody who I know is getting into spiritualism and they're trying to find themselves or trying to understand reality and consciousness, these are the three books that I really give them. The Upanishads more so, because it's one of these books that really is a reflection of the introspection, of looking into the self. It's full of different analogies and so forth that kind of are the self-reflection, the trying to understand the inner self, the inner understanding of the self, the good and evil of the self, how the self actually walks upon this earth and interacts with material things as being a spiritual being. What was it for you that got you interested in the Vedas?
Well, it was, in fact, one of the three texts that you mentioned there, the Bhagavad Gita, which is sometimes called the Gita Upanishad. It's really a conversation between an ordinary person, Arjuna, and Krishna, who in the Bhagavad Gita is described as Bhagavan, means the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the source of all conscious being. So Arjuna had gotten into a dilemma in his life, and he needed to figure some things out, and he wasn't getting the answers from his own mental and intellectual abilities. He was sort of spinning his wheels. So he approached Krishna to discuss these things, and it's a big conversation. One thing I like about the Vedic literature is that it's not usually presented in the form of some dogma or list of teachings that you have to accept. It's presented as a series of questions. There's a conversation that goes on between the guru or teacher, whoever it is, and the person who's making the inquiry. And it's the teacher wants to know what the questions are in the person's mind. What are the doubts? So there's a dialogue that goes on. So I really appreciate that aspect of things, because I think ultimately one of the problems in the world today is kind of exclusive claims for truth, dogmatic truth, truth that is imposed upon others by force. And I think that's not really truth. Truth is something one has to be persuaded about and willfully accept and understand thoroughly. It shouldn't be dogmatic or sectarian.
You know, one of the greatest lessons that I learned from the teachings of the Vedas was something that I've kind of put into my own words these days, and kind of enveloped it within a whole theoretical base of consciousness reality that I've derived from various other sources as well. But it comes about with describing the Godhead, Brahma, as the absolute, that which is unknowable, it's incomprehensible, it's unimaginable. It is everything in totality, in its infinite expansion beyond time, because time is within it. It's incomprehensible. So I just call it the absolute. And I look at truth as your understanding of the absolute, and this becomes self-evident. And the self-evident truth is the only derivation of truth we can know. So there only becomes two truths in reality, is that of the absolute, which is unknowable, and that of the being who is trying to realize the truth, and that which becomes self-evident.
Yeah. There's one Sanskrit word for the absolute truth is tattva. It means pretty much exactly that, a truth that is absolute. And there's one mantra that describes it. Vedanti tattva vidhas tattvam yaj jnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavan iti shabdi. It's similar verses are found in the Upanishads. It means this truth, all the great intelligences are searching after, is ultimately one, but it's realized differently by those who approach it. Some approach it strictly through intellectual reasoning, and the aspect of the absolute truth that they arrive at by perception, not just intellectual word jugglery, but by actual perception and realization, is called Brahman. It means the undifferentiated energy of the absolute truth. It's beyond any kind of limitation or boundary. It's just pure energy or light, some call it. And that is one realization of the absolute truth. Another approach is not by intellectualizing about it, but by meditating on the absolute within. The absolute within. And when one realizes that, you can say, oh, the absolute is within me, it's within you, it's within everything, and it's perceived in that way. That's called Paramatma realization of the absolute truth. Many yogis are on that path, trying to realize the presence of the absolute within heart. And then a final third realization of the absolute comes from Bhagavan realization, which means understanding as a conscious being. I am individual, personal, and conscious. And everyone who is listening to this program is conscious, individual, and personal. We all have our individuality. We have different tastes in clothing, different opinions about different subjects. We're individuals and we're persons and we're conscious. We're not just machines made of matter. So our source, the source of all of these conscious, personal, individual beings is also conscious, individual, and personal. And perceiving that aspect of the absolute truth is the goal of the system of yoga and meditation that I follow, bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. So, yes, there is an absolute truth, and it has something to do with consciousness. This vision of reality makes sense only in a cosmology that is consciousness-based instead of matter-based, as we have now. A lot of what I'm saying would just make no sense to someone who's committed to a very materialistic understanding of the cosmos and ourselves. That the only thing that exists is matter. Anything else is produced from matter. Consciousness is produced by chemicals interacting in the brain, and at the time of death, when the chemicals stop interacting, there's no more consciousness. Everything is oblivion. I think that's the fundamental difference between the absolute truth as we're talking about it and the absolute truth of someone who accepts a matter-based worldview or cosmology.
And that's a good point to bring that in there, because I did a lot of psychotropic drugs when I was a lot younger. And this allowed me to expand my mind during a time that I was still growing into adolescence, which probably wasn't the best idea. I don't recommend it to anybody. I'm lucky I got out with my chemicals balanced and that I'm still alive. With that being said, there were certain things that you realize as you go through these, is that matter really isn't as we perceive it to be, but we live in a very, very energetic universe. If we start looking throughout all of mythology, all of contemporary religions, there is one fundamental basis that we see, and this is that there is consciousness at the root of every single one of them. It's not matter then consciousness, it's always consciousness at the root. And this is one thing that we've taken out of antiquity and we brought into the modern day spiritualism. But the antithesis of this is modern day science, which it seems to not only that they move away from it, but they also try to bury any evidence of it. They try to just destroy anybody who tries to even suggest it.
Yeah, and that may be because previous versions of this consciousness-based reality that they received came from sources that were very dogmatic and didn't have a complete understanding of it themselves. And in other words, I'm talking about the history of science in Europe, where they were, in a sense, reacting to the church as it existed in their day. And even, of course, even within the church, there were people from a religious point of view, they were called the Protestants, who didn't like what was going on in the church. And for those who were approaching things from the scientific angle, they didn't like what happened to Galileo and things like that. So, but maybe if they hear another version of this, it's possible some of them could be persuaded. And I think some of them are moving in that direction because even as you say, even our picture of matter is gradually changing, especially under the influence of things like quantum mechanics, where you have non-locality. Your picture of matter becomes quasi-spiritual in a sense, in the sense that it involves the entanglement with observers. So I'm not completely hopeless regarding modern science, although it is still somewhat, as you've depicted it, very hostile to some of these things.
Right. And it's interesting, too, because you said a lot of people in modern science are now starting to understand and adopt this. And one of the men that I know of, that I've read about, that I've researched, that did this, was a physicist by the name of David Bohm. Now, David Bohm, he was one of the men who worked with Albert Einstein on the Manhattan Project to develop the nuclear bomb. He came out and wrote some very, very interesting books in the 1950s and the 1960s about implicate and explicit order. He was used as a reference by a guy by the name of Michael Talbot in a 1994 book called The Holographic Universe, where he talks about the research of Carl Pribram and David Bohm, but where their research really discusses the objective that reality is consciousness-based and it's holographic in its nature. And David Bohm, by the way, was really good friends with GETTR Krishnamurti and had adopted the Vedic spiritual teachings in the 1960s all the way up until the day he passed away in the 1990s.
Yeah, actually, many of the early founders of quantum mechanics, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, people like that, they were very familiar with the Vedic literature, especially the Upanishads, which you were mentioning, because many of the ideas that they were developing in quantum mechanics, they said they could see echoes of in the Upanishads.
Yeah, there's even rumors Oppenheimer used it in that one speech where he was pale white as a ghost talking about it and looked like he had just murdered millions of people with a device that he had created. And he says, I have now become, I have now become destroyed.
Time.
What is it?
He's become time, the destroyer.
Destroyer of words, that's right. And, it's interesting because the rumor is circulating around one of the reasons why he utilized that quote that night was they got the idea for the Manhattan Project, for the creation of the nuclear bomb through fission reactions, from actually researching old ancient Indian sites and finding various sand samples that had been heated to enormous degrees and turned to glass. And they had seen various isotopic remains of cesium decay and strontium decay, which indicated to them that it was radioactive decay from a very, very long time ago. And so they tried to figure out what would have caused this, and this was one of the things that led them to the creation of the nuclear bomb.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard some of these things, and I really like to see some documentation of them. If you've got any, send it along.
I have about 500 notebooks. and I'm going to have to dig into it because everything that I put in there is referenced. And so I will go back in there. I'll dig into it and see if I can find that for you. But yeah, it's incredibly interesting to just start looking at the state of the world today because, one of the biggest problems that I see with the world today is a lack of awareness of consciousness, is in a lack of awareness of our spiritual nature. Do you see this as well?
Yes, I do. And just a few weeks ago, I was in Tucson, Arizona for a conference. It was called the Science of Consciousness. It's held every couple of years, brings together from around the world leading neuroscientists, consciousness studies experts. It's really a fantastic thing. But what they're trying to do, or at least a good many of them are trying to do, is find what they call the neural correlates of consciousness. They believe that consciousness is produced by the neurons, the nerve cells in the brain. But they said one of the leading experts in this field, a man named Christoph Koch, he said, I was 20 years ago at this conference, I was saying, we've got it within 20 years, we'll have it all figured out. And 20 years later, he stood up there. I was there when he said it the first time, 20 years ago. And I heard him say it this time. 20 years later, we're no closer to finding a solution to this problem of how consciousness is generated by the brain than we were 20 years ago. And who knows how long? I don't think they'll ever really be able to figure it out in that way. So it may be that the brain isn't producing consciousness, it's just a channel through which consciousness, which comes from some other source, a non-material source, is expressing itself, through this physical machinery, which includes the brain. And consciousness, the conscious self that's expressing itself through this machinery, this biological machinery, has no beginning, no end, which means that when this machinery breaks down, the biological machinery breaks down, as it inevitably will at the time of death, that isn't the end of the conscious self. It persists, it goes on, it has another origin. And I believe that is the most fundamental truth that the great educational and scientific institutions of the world are missing. And because of that, there are so many problems in this world today because we're mistaking who and what we really are. So I think one reason why we feel some discomfort or dissatisfaction with this situation is that we know instinctively deep in our hearts that we're beings of pure consciousness, that we're eternal, full of knowledge, full of bliss, pleasure. That's why we feel unhappy in this situation, because we know we're really meant for something else, something beyond producing and consuming more and more material things in competition with others trying to do the same thing. And, it's not a very satisfying conception of life, ultimately. So, so I think that's a very fundamental issue We're really beings of pure consciousness. We're not biological machines made of matter.
Right.
That's not a real identity.
Yeah, in modern science, you mentioned Christoph Koch right there, and you know it's interesting because you're never going to find the internet by looking at the antenna, right? If you're looking at your Wi-Fi antenna and you're trying to find the internet, you're never going to find it because they're looking in the wrong place and they don't truly understand the dynamics of how the system operates. And you know, occultism, esoteric mysteries, religions, philosophies have been talking about this for millennia, and it's just I just found it confounding that these people, they are so analytical and so intelligent, but yet they cannot see the truth that's right in front of them. I mean, you know, 20 minutes of meditation a day for about 1 month will have people on the journey of starting to realize themselves. Do you know who Michael Shermer is, the Skeptics magazine?
Yes, I do. I've spoken with him on his show, not recently, but I know who Michael Shermer is, yeah.
So just recently, like the last few years, he's gotten into meditation. And so he's been working with who's the Indian doctor in Hollywood that
Deepak Chopra.
Deepak Chopra, that's it. He's been working with Deepak and been doing meditation, and he's starting to come around in a lot of different senses. Not in the sense of the information, he's very, very pertinent on that, but in the sense of discovering a spiritual self and maybe understanding God and understanding the soul. I think he's getting there.
Yeah, I saw a similar type of thing in Tucson, Arizona. There was one evening there was a debate between Deepak Chopra and Susan Blackmore, who I don't know if you've ever encountered her and her work, but she's kind of a British equivalent to Michael Shermer. Very skeptical about the idea that there could be a conscious self that exists apart from the body, and anything paranormal she's very skeptical about. So they had a kind of a discussion, but turns out she's also into meditation of a Buddhist kind.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you're pointing out is something I just mentioned, that even though we're in this situation and we're thinking, well, we really are just beings made of matter, still you have to do something. You have to meditate. You have to do something to have some other conception, because just the conception that, hey, I'm a machine made of matter in competition with every other machine made of matter in this world is not a very satisfying thing. It really disturbs the mind. So, well, I wish both of them well.
I do too, and I hope that everybody that has doubts on the nature of reality, or at least their interpretation or other people's interpretation, get to see other people's perspectives. And I think that's one of the great things about going out there, investigating and talking to people, is you get to learn a lot about people's understandings of the world, people's different perspectives and perceptions of the world. And I think that's one of the greatest mechanisms of knowledge delivery that the universe has created, is the ability to communicate very, very complex and structured concepts and ideas to each other, which it become relatable, and they attach emotion to them, to where you can feel them internally to yourself and begin to conceptualize them within your own being and grasp them as your own and begin to experience something even similar to someone else.
Yeah, of course, here we're talking, I mean, you and I are pretty much on the same page. And many of the people who are tuning in, listening, looking. They're also pretty much on the same wavelength. Where it becomes interesting is when you do as I do many times, is go into the other camp. You go into a meeting of scientists, whether they're physicists or archaeologists, and try to persuade them. I mean, my particular philosophy or communication strategy, you might call it, is to stay in touch with all of the groups that are interested in a certain question, whether it's the origin of life, the origin of the universe, the origin of consciousness, the origin of the human species. Let me try to stay in touch with, say my main topic is human origins and antiquity. That's what my books that I'm best known for are about, like archaeology, human devolution, and titles like that. So I try to stay in touch with the academic scientists, and even among them, there are different groups. Some are more open-minded and some are less open-minded. But I know what the different groups are, and I interact with them. And then there's the general public. Then there's people who are into the paranormal, into UFOs, into forbidden archaeology. And there are people from all different perspectives. So I try to stay in touch with all of them because I think everyone's got something to contribute to this, what I call renegotiation of our picture of reality. I think there are a lot of stakeholders that have to be brought into this if there's going to be a satisfactory overall result. So,
well, what's your thoughts on history's role on self-discovery? I mean, if we're talking about forbidden archaeology, we know that a lot of this stuff has been hidden from us. We know that human origins date back millions upon millions of years and possibly even hundreds of millions of years. And so what does this say now in the sense of the state of reality? Because to me, it seems that if you suppress knowledge of one's history, that person will develop a type of psychosis, a deep yearning to discover who and what they are with no success in that venture because the information has been erased. What do you think?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. The past influences the present, and the present also influences our picture of the past, because as you were suggesting, and as I am convinced is the case, because of the current paradigm, that science is working under, particularly archaeologists and anthropologists and people who are studying human origins, because they're committed to a certain paradigm, that means they tend to edit the evidence that has existed in the past. And, they edit the evidence or filter it. I call it a process of knowledge filtration. That although there is archaeological evidence that humans have existed for millions of years on this planet, that evidence doesn't make it into today's textbooks because of this knowledge filtering process that goes on. Things that don't fit the current paradigm, well, set aside, they're forgotten, they're ignored. In some cases, they're actively suppressed or destroyed even. Those kinds of things happen. And the result is, we in the present, we don't have the complete set of facts that would allow us to understand who we really are and where we came from. But it's not just a matter of the present and the past. We also have to think about the future. Where are we headed? And it doesn't seem we're headed in a very good direction at the present moment. And that may be because of larger forces operating on a cosmic scale in the universe. According to the Vedic teaching, there are vast cycles of time. We're kind of aware of time cycles, the day-night cycle. For most people, night means you go to sleep. Daytime means you're awake, you're working, you're going to school, you're doing something. We're kind of aware of a seasonal cycle, like winter, spring, summer, fall. In the temperate climate areas, we perform different sports, we do different sports in the different seasons. There's a season for baseball and football and basketball, and we wear different clothes in the different seasons, eat different foods. But ancient people may have been aware of even larger cycles. In the Vedic cosmology, they were called yugas, and there was a cycle of 4 of them, like the seasons. And the first cycle is a time of simplicity and spirituality. Everyone's living in harmony with nature. They haven't divided themselves up into different classes like rich and poor. They're living a very harmonious, natural, simple life, and they're able to put most of their human energy into developing the resource of consciousness. And then in the next stage, things get a little more complicated. They start dividing themselves up into different groups, different classes. And then in the next stage, things get a little worse. There's large-scale wars. And then finally, in the 4th age, the one we've entered into fairly recently, it's an age of ever-increasing social and environmental disturbance, which we kind of see happening even in our own lifetimes. So we have to think about the future as well. And if we want to mitigate the effects of this current age that we live in, we're going to have to individually and collectively begin to somehow or other focus on this consciousness-based picture of reality and do what's necessary to, because we have to think about the future as well. What can we give people to help them survive in this age of increasing disturbance?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the Yuga cycles, because part of my research has been looking at the precessional cycles, and one thing that I'm good at is pattern recognition. And it's something that's dominated my life for a very long time. I love finding and discovering patterns. And one perspective that I've shown is that if we watch the sun every day in the sky at noon and you put a dot in the sky, the sun does this figure 8 shape called an analemma through the sky. This is where symbolically through esoteric mysteries and occultism, this is where we get the infinity symbol. This is where we get the number 8, which is beyond God. If you watch the moon for the 29.5 day cycle that moon does through the sky, it does a figure 8 through the sky. And this is just a perceptual reference to where that object is in the sky and the Earth's rotation around it in both of those rotations. And so I expanded this idea and I said, if I was outside, if I was marking the galactic center through the sky, I would begin to see the same thing over a 26,500 year cycle. I would begin to see this analemma form, of which our solar system transits the galactic center and goes down and goes up, and it would appear to do this figure 8 shape where it comes up to a summer, it comes up to 2 equinoxes, a fall and a spring, and then it goes into a winter. And so I correlated this to various different cataclysmic events and all these different things. And you come to find out that right now, the age of Aquarius is this entering of this downslope of where we're entering this winter in this galactic cycle. Now, it doesn't mean that it's very, very cold or anything like that, but I attributed this to the receptibility of DNA. DNA has a certain receptibility to the microwave wavelength. It's about 34.5 gigahertz, which is almost equivalent to the peak frequency of the cosmic microwave background radiation here on Earth. Dr. Martin Blank, 2014-2015, published a series of articles that your DNA is an electromagnetic transducer in fractal antenna, meaning that it sends and receives signals in this range. And I looked at this and said, well, what if this signal was being projected out by the universe and that our transit through the galaxy was impeded as we went through the center and increased in receptibility the further and further down or up that we went out away from the densest parts of the galactic center? And I started looking through history, and you just start seeing these periods of darkness, these periods of sadness and depression. Then you see these periods of ages of enlightenment, and you start to correlate them to these different precessional cycles, like the Sphinx, which was many believe was Leo 10,500 years ago. It faces east in the exact spot on the precessional rising of the sun in the constellation of Leo. And I think that our ancestors were marking these ages. They were marking these with a lot of these various different temples, landmarks, cities, and that they were trying to remind us because they understood that civilizations come and go, and that through these various different analemma wave cycles that our solar system does through the galaxy, that there is great cataclysm that comes about with that, and that to preserve the knowledge, we must do it within the natural resources of stone and so forth, and through obviously the word of mouth.
Yeah, it's interesting that you point out that many ancient structures have alignments and that are connected with these celestial phenomena. Like I went to Cambodia once to visit the Angkor Wat temple and some other temples around there. But a lot of this astronomical knowledge was built into the actual temple structure. Like if you're at the front of the temple, it's got a big wall that kind of goes around the whole complex. And in the center, there's a gate, and then there's some towers at each corner of the wall. And if you stand in front of the main wall near the entrance of it, and the sun rises behind it on the equinoxes, it rises in certain position, just connected with the wall. During the solstices, I think it goes like the solstices are the winter and summer solstices. The sun's rising point is at opposite ends of the wall, and at the equinox, it's kind of at a certain place too. And that, to build a structure so that it's aligned to those movements of the sun, is just really amazing. You just have to think these people had amazing knowledge that they'd be able to calculate and build a structure that maps that. It's pretty amazing.
It is, and you know, one of the ones that was in the news more recently, and I didn't hear anybody talking about this when I couldn't believe it. In April of 2021, there was the laying the rest of the kings and the queens of the new kingdom of Egypt, and this is where they moved them from Luxor to the new museum in Cairo, and they did this, and they had this big parade to do it. And then 9 months later, 270 days, the human gestation period, okay, they had another ceremony on the King's Highway. Do you remember they reopened the King's Highway for this one ceremony? And I said, oh my God, this is an occult ceremony of ushering in the new age. And basically what they were doing is they were putting the rest, the old kingdom, which would have been the new kingdom of Egypt, they were putting them to rest, and they were ushering in with this new ceremony, the new age, because the King's Road or Ramses Road is between Luxor and Karnak. Now, if you go to the Temple of Luxor, you go to the Temple of Karnak, you got the rising of the sun over the winter solstice, and then you have the rising of the sun over the summer solstice. So it represents the two various solstices between that road. It's 1.7 miles long, which just happens to be the stellar declination of the sun Sirius, which is representative of Osiris. And so I just found it absolutely fascinating that these ancient ceremonies were once again being redone on Earth, and it kind of brings about this whole aspect of occultism that is still practiced today on this planet by some very, very rich, powerful elitists.
Yeah, were any of them present at those gatherings?
You know, there was no mention of them being present at the gatherings. That's one thing I was looking for, and you couldn't find if anybody showed up there.
Well, there were some reports of billionaire, what do they call them? Cruise ships or private yachts, huge yachts, being present in Turkey, which is, yeah, at around that time, it's kind of like the same area of the world, not exactly Egypt.
Yeah,
that's pretty interesting.
I find it fascinating. One thing that my research has pinned on is ritualistic magic and how various occult traditions have grown and evolved throughout the last few hundred years, few thousand years, and really what the true derivation and the meaning of a lot of these ancient teachings really were. And one thing that I've found is if you start looking at the mythology of multiple cultures, and one thing that I do is I use your filtering mechanism, is I start removing everything that I see as a cultural attribution or is astrotheological in nature. So many cultures would adopt various different mythological belief structures, and they would begin to incorporate their grain harvest and planting cycles into these mythological stories. They would start giving them cultural attributes. They would rename the deities. And so once we start removing all of that from it, we start seeing that many of these Greek, these Roman, these Akkadian, Canaanite, Sumerian gods and goddesses are all really probably about 12 various gods and goddesses all incorporated throughout the whole globe. That is a story that's being told. And the story that we found is really of ancient human origins that been on this planet for millions of years and have endured great cataclysm, war, have had spiritualism and technological advancements throughout the years, and it's been destroyed, and this cycle keeps on repeating itself.
Yeah, and well, the one point I would add is I don't think the existence of these gods and the underlying patterns that you observe are necessarily contradictory.
Agreed.
I think they can both exist. Yeah, but that's another thing that some researchers have noticed is the alignments of many of these structures, ancient structures. They're aligned to the cardinal directions. In other words, north, north and then east, west, north, south. But the problem is the North Pole, the magnetic North Pole at least, has moved over time. I think even the geographical North Pole has shifted over time, so that some researchers say that by seeing where a building or structure is aligned, you can see that it was pointing to a place where the North Pole was maybe 50,000 years ago. That helps you date, the structure.
Yeah, and when we start looking at history, I wear a bracelet, and so this bracelet I've had this since 2008, so 14 years, and it's a Tibetan bracelet. It was given to a friend of mine. So I met this gentleman at my master Reiki certification back in 2008. I was going to be a Reiki therapist, and I met this gentleman there. And when I first walked, I kind of went down these stairs and I turned left into the doorway, and it was like walking into a spider web of energy. It was the weirdest thing I've ever experienced in my life. And he's like, "Did you feel that?" I'm like, "Yeah." And we started talking, and we realized that we probably had been in many lives together. And his brother just passed away, and he was going to go travel the world and kind of meet some of the people that his brother knew. His brother was a world-renowned botanist and herbologist. Basically never had an ID, never had any money, got 2 master's degrees, and was sent across the world to study with the Dogon, with the shamans of South America, with the monks of Eastern Asia. And when he went to Thailand, he was at the Sleeping Buddha temple. And the head monk there walked out and said, "I got something for you. Come with me." And he's like, "I don't even know you." And he went back there, and the guy said, I blessed these bracelets for you. And you know who to give the other one to. It's someone you've had many lives together. And then I kind of, when he came back, he kind of told me, "Hey, I need to talk to you." I'm like, "Sure." So the night before, I went into a trance-like meditation. And I asked, "Where do I know this gentleman from? Where do I know this guy from?" And I had this very, very realistic vision of myself in full Roman battle armor. I was an undergeneral to a general. And me and him were standing there with our hands clasped, and we said a prayer, and we said, "If we shall die in this life, shall we see each other in the next?" The next day I went to visit him, and he tells me the story of these bracelets and then gives me one of the bracelets. And I'm like, "This is crazy. Like, how do I know you?" And he goes, "I've been getting this weird feeling inside me that we were Roman soldiers together, and we made this promise that if we died in that life, shall we meet each other in the next?" And I started sobbing. I'm like, "Oh my God, like, this is real. This is incredibly real." So what are your thoughts on reincarnation?
I accept it. I don't have as clear a memory of past life as you do, but I definitely have gotten deja vu feelings because I travel extensively around the world. And some places I come to just have the feeling, a very strong feeling, I've been here before. I may not be able to recover the memory of it in exactly the same way you've been able to identify perhaps previous existence as a Roman subgeneral or soldier of some kind. So, but I definitely think that has happened. However, I look at it like this. You may have an actor, Tom Cruise or whoever, some actor that in the course of his career as an actor plays many different roles. And they really have to get into character. I've read accounts of actors, how they, or the whole time that they're shooting the film, they're just totally identified with the character. They don't get out of character, even when they're off the stage, off the camera. They just maintain the character, for the whole time they're involved with it. And that can get kind of confusing. So you lose the sense of who you really are. Yeah, you can say, well, in this film I was a king, and in this film I was a soldier, and in this film I was a cowboy, and in this film I was a businessman, in this film I was a gangster. But the real point is, who are you really beyond the roles that you play in all of these different films? Maybe that's why some have to go into therapy or analysis. So I think that's what I'm trying to realize. Who am I? What am I beyond all of these roles that I've played? Because in the course of different lifetimes, because I think a human body or any other body is really a vehicle for a soul, a conscious self that has an identity beyond the different vehicles that it occupies on this level of reality in the cycle of reincarnation. So that is what the process of bhakti yoga is meant to uncover. The real, you could say, spiritual identity that I have, apart from all of the temporary roles that I play in different vehicles, human vehicles, or even other types of vehicles, plants, animal. Yeah, we're not limited to the human vehicle.
Now, do you think that the soul evolves through the aeons? That maybe it starts out as an atom, and the atom evolves into 2 atoms and 10 atoms, and throughout its existence, this consciousness grows and evolves into various life forms. I've always looked at it is that it's incredibly difficult for a consciousness to regress. And the reason I say that is because of the fundamental laws of matter, is that energy equals MC squared, right? Is that our mass and energy have to be equivalent. This is one of the reasons why I look at it in the sense that for the first 7 years of a human being's life, they are in this very vulnerable subconscious state where the soul is really coming into being. This is why a lot of indigenous tribes and religions celebrate what's called the coming into being. This coming into being ceremonies and so forth, because this is when the soul finally latches on and comes into the body fully. And I look at it, the soul as this high potential energy that is trying to enter the body, and it has to wait till the body matures enough for it to fully come in. And so I've always perceived that energy itself, or the soul itself, is on an evolutionary process. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's largely the case, but I look, that yes, because of its state of awareness, a soul may be in a vehicle that it might be as limited as an atom, but the next vehicle might be an amoeba, and the next vehicle might be a multicellular creature like a sponge. And then you get the different plant and animal vehicles. So there is an evolution of the soul through these different types of bodily vehicles. And the human vehicle is especially important because in that human vehicle, there's a possibility to realize that one, as a being of pure consciousness, doesn't have to be in a series of temporary material bodies undergoing a cycle of birth and death endlessly. On this level of reality, there's a possibility to realize, it's like a school. You can graduate from the school and go to another level of life. So there's another level of existence for the conscious self. That's the level of pure consciousness. And there's no temporary bodily vehicles. So that's how I see it, through the lens of the Bhakti yoga tradition that I've been initiated into. It's like you were mentioning earlier that there are these different wisdom traditions that you have to be kind of connected with in order to fully understand what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot to do with a lot of things in the sense of, mysteries, the esotericism and the occultism, is you have to be initiated, and you have to be beyond the initiation. You have to be into the adepts and the higher degrees. Pertaining to that, in Hermeticism, which is one that I've been initiated into, there's this teaching of God, that God is within me, yet I am not he. And so this correlates directly to the Vedic principles of the Godhead, where Brahma exists within all beings, but yet no being is Brahma himself. Is that correct in that correlation?
Yeah, this gets back to our initial discussion about tattva, absolute truth, and the Vedic concept. I was explaining there are three different realizations of the absolute truth. One is the Brahman effulgent, the kind of what some people call the white light, the undifferentiated oneness of everything. That's one aspect of it. That's called Brahman realization. Then there's Paramatma realization, the idea that God is present in the hearts of everyone, along with the individual soul. In the Upanishads, this is described as two birds sitting in a tree, and one bird is eating the fruit of the tree, is totally absorbed in the tree, but next to him is another bird. That's the Paramatma. That's the localized representation of God within the heart. In other words, the Supreme Soul is there, the individual soul is there. They're described as two birds in a tree. One is eating the fruit. The other is waiting for the bird to get tired of eating the fruit of material happiness and material distress. It comes from the tree of the material body, which is rooted in matter, whereas the real self is from the level of pure consciousness. But the Lord in the heart is waiting for the other bird to turn to him. I'm saying him because it's kind of beyond that. But so the Lord is waiting for the other bird to turn to it. And then when that happens, they both fly off to the higher level of reality, leaving behind the tree of material body. So that process is, or that fact, or that kind of realization of Param Atma, the superior self and the individual self, is definitely there in the Bhagavad Gita. It's there in the Upanishads. It's there in the Vedic teachings in general.
That's fast. I love that. You know what? I haven't read them in over a decade. They used to be books that I read just continuously year after year. Thinking about that correlation, though, that's if I remember correctly, Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita was basically going to battle with his uncle, and his assistant was next to him, standing on the hill, looking down at their armies when he had moments of self-introspection. And his assistant appears to him then as Krishna. And they have this massive, in-depth conversation where he reveals himself to Arjuna as Krishna, as God. He shows the 1,000 faces of God. And I believe one of the faces was Arjuna, in the sense that he showed him that he was he as well, and that his decisions, they mattered only to his karmic affliction, but not towards the whole fate of the universe, and that he would decide what is right because that is the natural process.
Yeah, that's part of the Bhagavad Gita called the vision of the universal form, which means the universe is actually a form of God, basically. Yeah, if you had, when Arjuna asked Krishna if he could see that universal form, Krishna said, yes, you can see it, but you can't see it with these eyes. I have to give you divine eyes, divine vision. So when he had that divine vision, he could perceive, the first thing he saw was this blinding white light, this blinding effulgence that he described as being as if you had millions of suns all gathered together in one place. If you look at even the sun, one sun in the sky, it's pretty brilliant. You can't really gaze at it. But imagine millions of suns. That would be kind of like what he experienced. And then he was gradually able to perceive this, as you said, a 1,000-headed form of Krishna, this universal form, which was, as its feature of time, the destructive aspect of time, just everything was just going into the mouths of time, being destroyed, which is actually what's happening all around us. Time is constantly wearing away everything material in this world. So he had this vision, but then he kind of had enough of seeing it, take that away. The vision was withdrawn. And it's kind of like you said, Krishna instructed him, this battle that you're engaged in, it's going to happen whether you take place or not.
Yeah.
And the question is, are you going to be an instrument in it or not? And I mean, the purpose of that particular battle was to establish the forces of good and light against the forces of darkness and evil. that were competing for control of the world at that time. So that is the vision of the universal form.
That's just absolutely fascinating. Michael, I know you got some things coming up. What do you have coming up? Where can people find you? Do you have any lectures coming up or places people can visit yet? Any seminars, any conferences?
There'll be, if people go to the schedule link on my website, mcremo.com, mcremo.com, they'll see that there's an event coming up on the 25th and 26th. It's a virtual conference. It's called the Indus Valley Civilization Conference. It's I'll be speaking about the ancient archaeology of India at that conference. At the end of this month, after that conference, I'll be going to Europe. I'll be going to Prague, where I'll be presenting a paper at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress. Of course, it's open to the general public if they pay a registration fee, but it's a professional conference of archaeologists. Now, and as I was mentioning in the beginning of the show, that's one of my audiences, because I think they have something to contribute, some of them at least, and if they'll listen to some alternative ideas, that's also good for them, I think.
Awesome. And then on your website, mcremo.com/order is where you can find copies of Michael's books. This is on the, you guys can see this on the stream right now. This is mcremo.com, Forbidden Archaeology. If you go down here, 3 easy ways to order. You can call 360-595-0481. Print order form and close check and money order will payable to Unlimited Resources, P.O. Box 50, Acme, Washington 98220, or click on the links to the electronic order form and email. You can use MasterCard, Visa, American Express, and Discovery. And also they have a secure Woo checkout you can check out. You have his newest book, My Science, My Religion. And I believe, are you still doing that deal where
if they order that book from the website, they will have the opportunity to receive, if they want, a free copy of Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the books that we've been talking about, you and I here.
There it is. And this would be the Bhagavad Gita as it is?
Yes.
Gotcha. And then he's got, prolific author, guys. The Forbidden Archaeologist, you have Nature's IQ, Human De-Evolution, Forbidden Archaeology, The Hidden History of the Human Race, The Hidden History of the Human Race, Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, Papers, Reviews, Letters, and Interviews, Rethinking Darwin, Divine Nature, Life Comes in Life, Beyond Illusion and Doubt, Human De-Evolution, the DVD. Tons of stuff on here. I recommend you guys go on over there, support Michael and his work. Michael, just a fascinating conversation tonight. I absolutely love this. I appreciate you so much more than you could ever know. And you've been a big inspiration to myself and my evolution into who I am today. It was a lot of your work early on in my life that really brought me to a lot of the realizations that I've had. So I thank you before that.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Keeps me going.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, we're going to go to Fringe After Dark in about 45 minutes at 9:30 Mountain Standard Time, 11:30 Eastern Standard Time. You guys can find that on socialredpill.com. Other than that, no Mars Chronicle tomorrow, but Makes You Think crowd will see you. We love you guys. I hope you guys have a great night. We'll take care. Talk to you soon. Good night, guys.